If everybody's all ready, let's begin. Just pull our consciousness to the point between the eyebrows, thinking the sense of self tends to be centered at the medulla, which is where our ego identifies with our body. And what we are needing to do spiritually is to transfer our sense of identity from identification with the limited to awareness of the infinite. So we literally sit in the medulla and look upward into the spiritual eye until the power of the spiritual eye is so great that our point of reference transfers. So feel as if just above the horizon line, you're just looking out at a beautiful, expansive world of light and color, and you can imagine the vast ocean or the sky or an image of light, but feel as if you're looking out a window just above the horizon line. But more than looking, it's like you're unbottling yourself, like we're made out of very lighter than air, a lighter than air substance that's held in the body with a cork on the top. But if we can remove the cork, that which is ourself automatically rises. So you don't have to do it with willpower to push, you merely have to stop holding back. So feel that natural expansion of self into that great field of light which you can't see the edge of. It's much wider than we can see. Well, infinite in scope. So with the feeling of real relationship to that infinite expanse, let's invoke the presence of the Masters and feel as if we're saying each manifestation of the divine, Father, Mother, Friend, each expression of the divine through the line of gurus that inspire this work, that we're not merely repeating, but we're actually speaking. When you see someone you love for the first time, even the first time in the morning, even if you live with them, when you greet them, you don't greet them as a duty. It's a relationship. You're genuinely happy to see them, I hope. But let's say you are. And their name then is much more than, it's not a neutral word. It evokes everything that consciousness in that person represents to you. So when we pray, we have to pray with that kind of consciousness of joy, of joyous recognition and welcome. So let's pray together. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved, dear God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, humbly we bow to all. Open our hearts that we may know from within ourselves the truth of your presence, always with us, guiding and blessing. Help us to open ourselves with devotion and fearlessly to your transforming self. Om. Peace. Amen. Let's just spend a few moments in silent meditation now. The subject today is immensely personal. So how our time together manifests depends entirely on the consciousness of all of us together. So each in our own way, let us pray to the great masters, to the Guru who is closest to us, that his guiding presence will come and that each one of us will receive that which will help us to become closer to our true selves. Om, peace. Amen. We're going to use a microphone for your questions because that way it'll come out on the recording that will appear on the internet later, and it's annoying for the people who watch it later. You have to move that way. There you go. There you are. And otherwise it's frustrating for them because they can't hear. I find this topic so enormous that I actually have no idea where to begin. So I would appreciate it if we could turn on that microphone. And it's always on. You don't have to look at the button. You just have to be close enough to be able to, Joycey? No, I would like to just ask those of you who are here, I know some of you came because I've been away for a long time, but those of you who have an actual interest in this topic, or could manifest one, what would you like to hear on this subject? Like, what is it that, where should we pick this up from? So, does anybody want to volunteer to? Okay, there, very good. Just put your mouth close enough to the microphone, right?
So, can you hear me? There we go. So part of it for me is related to the process of creativity that you've been in and drawing on Swamiji to write. So just drawing, that's what comes to mind for me, is how to draw upon the gurus for creativity.
Well, that's a very good question. That's excellent. And happens to be what I've been doing for the last 4 years, so it's right up my alley. Okay. Uh-huh.
She's saying what I was thinking, that you've been for a long time doing this, and
right.
I want to hear, and not just words, but I feel like I will learn a lot.
Okay,
from
very good.
what you've been doing.
Okay. Behind you, Sneha.
My question is around a person's ability to draw a guru, and once you do have a guru, how does the guidance come? And for those who are not on a spiritual path, and do they have spiritual guidance available to them as well? And so, how does one draw inspiration from the divine and one's guru?
That's an excellent question. I like that too. Okay.
And for me, my question is more related around trust. How do you open up to trust somebody else to guide you?
Oh yeah, so that's big, isn't it? Okay, over here, right here.
I was thinking of it more in terms of attunement, how to become more receptive, to progress the relationship with the guru, to deepen it, that sort of thing.
Excellent. Back behind you.
I think for me is on the day-to-day basis, interacting with people, loved ones or co-workers or friends, to be reminded of that guidance and power.
To bring it down into real everyday, very small, all of our interactions.
And not just my own, emotional reactions, but really the guidance, the wisdom.
Right, exactly. Excellent. Okay, over here to Kathleen.
Mine is to be more aware of when the guru has already supported you. I mean, so often during the course of a day even, there are these little gifts that keep me going. Right. And keep me safe even. Right. And I'm aware that that has been happening over the years, but I wish that I could have a deeper relationship, a more devotional faith. I wish I could do my part.
Right. Well, I know what your part is. There's two parts to it. What is my part? And the second thing is then to do it. Yeah, both of them are true. And also to just, I don't know, where do I end? Where does the power of the infinite start? What's me? What's someone else? Yeah. And yeah, there's lots of good jokes about that, so I won't bother with them. You know, God, you ask to be rescued, but then the helicopter lands and you say, well, God, I don't need help because the helicopter's here now. You know? Okay, anyone else? All right, thank you. That was sort of just what I needed. We can make this conversation. So if you have any question, generally speaking, if I'm in the middle of a sentence but you have a thought, raise your hand, but I'll usually finish my thought. But then we can stop. Because this can go forever in 1,000 directions, so we might as well make it the directions you all want. So let me think for just a minute here. I think most of you, because of the group I'm looking at in this room, know my personal history. Not everybody who sees this will. But even for those who do know, I'm going to sort of give you a context because these last few years, especially this last year, have been watershed time for me. To make that simple and clear, when I was 24, which was not yesterday, let's just leave it there. Swami Kriyananda, my teacher, my pole star is the word that I've been using, suggested that it would be good for me to write a book about him. Not yet, he said at that point. I was already living at Ananda village. I'd moved there entirely and only to be close to him because I recognized that he was a pole star for me. Just like if I just kept my eye on where he was and tried to get closer to where he was, everything was going to work. He was the first person I'd ever met in my life who manifested the consciousness that I wanted to have. I'd met lots of people who were able to do things, but this was a person that I wanted to become like. And I was born because of past life yoga, with the awareness that it wasn't what I did, it was who I am that mattered. And all of Western society was oriented toward what I did. Fortunately, my family it was very moral and ethical. So who I was more important within my family. Who I was more important than what I did. But they also expected me to use the God-given talents, which had been dished out to me in a fair measure, so I was expected to use them. But my inner quality as a person was always valued. But in the school world, in all the world that I was in, nobody ever really cared. And what they asked of me, which I call school smart, didn't mean anything to me. It was not satisfying, and it required very little effort on my part. So little effort that it was absurd to be honored for it. You know, it was sort of like fixing a bowl of Cheerios. It just didn't mean anything to me, and yet you could get such accolades for doing that, which made me actually, the actual word for it I think is rather schizophrenic. Because on one hand you're being praised, and internally you realize you haven't done anything. So schizophrenic in the sense of just so divided that I was actually immensely insecure because of the sense of fraud between inner self and outer recognition. Not that I got those kinds of, nobody was falling at my feet or building statues or temples in my name. Excuse me, my throat is giving me trouble. I met Swami Kriyananda when I was 22 in 1969. I was already conscious of self-realization as a path, but I'd never seen a living example. I'd only read books. And I was looking at a living example and I knew it. And he was a teacher, and he had a community and he had a retreat, and it was, the door was wide open to put my life in close proximity to his. So I couldn't think of a single reason on the planet not to do it, so I did it and never looked back, basically. But when I was 24, and I knew right away that the experience I was having was not meant for me alone, because by karma and circumstances, I became his secretary, and within a half a year of being there, and I just worked very closely with him, and I was given a lot of, I became a friend. I was part of a circle of friends. Swamiji was incredibly relaxed and at ease, and everything was very informal. So we were really just a crowd of friends, enormous respect, and always a student-teacher relationship. But the way the relationship expressed was friendship. And he was 44. I was, 46 by then. Just, everybody was, we just had lots of fun, just a ton of fun. But he told me to write this book. And I had this was a project that would require effort. And because I had never had to try hard to do anything in my life, I had no idea how to go about it. I didn't understand discipline and effort because no one had ever asked me to do anything that required it. And I wasn't self-motivated. So I worried about it, as some of you have heard me say another. I worried about it every day. It's a lot of years to worry every day. So I worried every day. And then, most recently, the last 4 years, I finally wrote the book. And I finished it like 2 weeks ago, so it's a very fresh. But what happened in the process of doing that is I became much more conscious of attunement and much more conscious of how power works through us. And by no means was this the first time. In truth, pretty much everything I've done has been power working through rather than anything I've generated myself. But because I spent so much time in seclusion and therefore was not confused by the presence of others or the need to relate to them, I've just spent months and months alone with Swami working on this book. I mean, the subject of the book is him, and I've been living through 45 years of my own life with notes and all this. And, it was just my life with Swami Kriyananda, so it's basically been the two of us in this very long project. But in such a clear environment, it's easier to be able to tell what's really going on, because all of us are constantly being bombarded and subjected to influences that are either emanating through other people or are simply cosmic influences. Swamiji was fond of quoting different lines from Autobiography of a Yogi because that book has so many lines that you can spend your whole life trying to understand. And one of them is, thoughts are not individual, thoughts are universal. And we do not create the thoughts we express. We merely attune to them and then serve as a channel for them. And that is the entire spiritual path. The question is, the question that one has to figure out is, our physical bodies give the impression of individuality and separateness, and the fact that we live so much time in a subconscious world, and I don't just mean by that we're asleep, although that's part of it, but the nature of subconsciousness is that it's a self-contained, self-defined reality. And almost all of us live in a self-contained, self-defined reality in which I stand at the center and everything is understood in relation to me. When I was, just before I turned 19, when I read my first book of self-realization principles by Swami Vivekananda, who's the foremost disciple, one of those, of Sri Ramakrishna. He was an avatar who actually died just before Master was born in the 1800s in India. Vivekananda gave it several pieces of advice for how to live a happy, fulfilled life, and one of them was, don't think about yourself and you'll be happy. And my first thought, I still remember, was, what else is there to think about? You know? And it was just like, of course I was only in the end of my teen years, but I was always conscious of my own position, and in a way that was not as selfish as this is going to sound. I was always calculating my own position in relationship to the world around me. Now, in my case, because I was generally a fairly cheerful and a rather giving person, it wasn't like I was calculating my selfish advantage, but I always knew where I stood in relation to pretty much everything around me, and I was generally trying to upgrade my potential to have fun. So I was always calculating whether or not, which choices were going to be the most enjoyable for me. And because I enjoyed helping people and being serviceful, that it often went that way. But it didn't make it any less self-centered. My entire life was entirely centered around what I would experience. And it was such a novel thought. I didn't even know where to begin. I didn't know where to begin to imagine that I wasn't the center of the whole universe, and that it wasn't my job just to keep track of myself and keep maximizing my own potential for fun and happiness as I defined it. But I literally remember, like, almost physically dragging my attention off of myself, even just to, like, I can remember going down the road counting the telephone poles, because I was trying to do something other than think about myself. I didn't understand japa, the continuous repetition of the name of God. That's what japa means. You know, a mantra, chanting, prayer. I was just beginning. I didn't understand. And I started intellectually, not devotionally, so those things didn't occur to me. But to actually not merely know it theoretically, but to actually live as if I was only one element in a greater reality. And I was not less important than any other element, but I wasn't more important either. I was simply closer to myself and more habituated to myself than I was to living in anyone else's reality. Now, contrast this to Master saying to one of his disciples, "You have a sour taste in your mouth, don't you?" I mean, he was as much in the body that he could tell what his devotee was tasting. And, you know, his disciple was shocked. And Master said, "I'm as much in your body as I am in my own." I mean, now that is a philosophical possibility, but the reason that most of us don't experience it is because we're so busy, we're so habituated to calculating the position of the one that we're in all the time. Master said, people make a grave mistake when they think that everything that happens to them personally concerns them personally. I mean, I have thought about that so many times, because again, it was the first time I heard that, I thought, you know, sort of like, of course it concerns me, how could it not? I mean, the whole idea was just, it came from a source I couldn't reject, but it was so incredibly wacky that I didn't know what to do with it. That's what happened to me a lot over the years with Swami Kriyananda. He would just say things that were just so nuts, there was just nothing I could do with them, like that. What could I do with that? But I didn't dare. It wasn't that I didn't dare. I knew it would be stupid to pit my ignorance against his wisdom, but I couldn't just swallow it because it made no sense to me, so I just put it on the shelf. Well, coming back to the idea that thoughts are universal, you know, there are these different vibrations of consciousness. We live in the material world on this planet at this time. There's an enormous spectrum of vibrations happening simultaneously on this planet. One of the pleasures of the astral world, so I'm told, is that you're in a homogeneous vibration. And you get the benefit of the doubt. Your best self gets a chance. I mean, even if we have more selfish aspects, if we're sincere in our desire for higher consciousness, we get to go to the highest vibration. You get to go to the highest vibration of which you are capable. On this planet, it's all just, I mean, especially now, it's intensifying, where there's an enormous expansion of light and then also just this enormous inrush of darkness. This is a very interesting time to be living, in which things are really polarizing. And that force of darkness, if it doesn't necessarily attack everyone in the same way. See, for some people, they might not be drawn into aggressive, negative action, but the darkness will express as fear of the aggressive, negative action. So it's like on whatever spectrum you're on, you have a top and a bottom. And you'll catch both sides of it. It'll just express in the form that matches you. And the more advanced you become, the higher the bottom, the higher the top, and the higher the bottom. But in between, we are really literally, and it's interesting because when Jesus was teaching, he used everyday examples that people could understand. So he talked to you about your wheat fields and when you would harvest them, and how you took care of your sheep, and how you pressed your olive oil, and how you made wine. And he would illustrate things in terms of what you would do with your sheep. If a sheep falls into a ditch on the Sabbath, you would take him out of the ditch, wouldn't you? So you read it now and you think, have I ever seen a sheep? Do I live where there's a ditch? It's like if I'm in New York City, I mean, I don't know what I'd do with a sheep. My landlord wouldn't let me have one. I mean, it's all just crazy. It doesn't make any sense. But to the people to whom he was speaking, they had sheep and they knew what they would do. They couldn't afford to lose him. They'd have to take him out of the ditch. It was just like, it was a very everyday example. What I was saying is, there's a lot of examples I'm finding now in my life that are vivid examples to me that are no longer vivid because other people are not living like that. When I was small, we had this radio, and it was a big radio, and it had this wonderful dial, and you would turn the knobs, and you would go from program to program. I know that radio still exists, but not like that. And radio just means, I do radio programs, which are not radio programs at all. I do it over the Skype, and someone is on the internet, and now it's called a podcast. It's not even called an audio recording, which is what I always called it. So I'm going to use radio because it's still a concept, and I suppose if I understood the science of it, it must be something to do the same when you turn on your computer. In other words, it's in the room. I mean, it's in the ether, you might say. And whether or not you hear it depends on how you tune your instrument. But your instrument does not create it. Your instrument merely aligns itself with the potential that's there and then becomes the instrument. If we actually did have a radio, if people still have radios, and I listen to the radio in the car, so I know it's still there. And as I travel from here to Ananda village, I finally figured out where the national public radio station is for each of the cities, and so I can now change the numbers. But I can hear it, and then I can't hear it anymore, and I have to reattune my instrument, then I can hear it, and then I have to reattune my instrument, and then I can hear it. And it's like I'm just driving down the highway, but somebody somewhere is broadcasting something, and if I want to receive it, I can receive it. And it is a perfect image of our own consciousness, which we think of as so personal, and the fact that there are literally an infinite number of programs, so to speak, being broadcast, and what we think of as ourself is really the station that we're tuned to. And what that means is everything about ourselves, I'll use the word, is mutable. Nothing is fixed. If we don't know where the right numbers are, if there's a lot of magnetism that keeps pulling it back, if we've pre-programmed certain stations and trained our radio to think if you're anywhere near this, this is where you should go, which I find when I don't even know what my car thing is doing, but it does certain things that surprise me. It gets grabbed. Certain stations grab it when I'm not trying to let it go there. It just gets grabbed, which is exactly how it feels, isn't it? You're heading in one direction, and then all of a sudden you're broadcasting a program you never really wanted to broadcast. And you have this very strong feeling that it concerns you personally. There you're going. So what happens to come to the specific way we're trying to talk about this today is when the power of a self-realized master, first of all, and it's very confusing, they express through a physical body, so they give the impression that there's somebody there. And they will also have a personality. Some of this is just a mystery. I have no idea how to explain it. I understand this from living so closely with Swami Kriyananda for so many years, and then hearing him talk about what Master was like, and then putting all of this together in my mind. He talked about Master, the way Master has come to be presented. Paramhansa Yogananda is who I mean when I say that, Master. Presented by many of his disciples, there is a desire to flatten him and make him, it's more like we have an idea of what he's supposed to be like, so let's call him this. And if you're sort of stern, he becomes a disciplinarian, and if you want him just to be cute, then he becomes sort of adorable. It just depends on what you want. But the real, when the infinite consciousness takes form, when an individual who has finished the journey and attained self-realization, out of compassion, incarnates again and lives among us, they actually really live among us. The best example I've been able to think of is being in prison. If you're inside a prison, you are subject to the laws of the prison. And even if you didn't do the deed, you're still subjected to the laws of it. And you have to adjust your reality according to the way the prison is run. If you're going to live within the prison, you can always just fly over the walls. But if you've chosen to go where the prisoners are, take on the conditions that they have to live with, and then show them how to live rightly and how essentially to earn your way out of prison, then you have to live according to those rules. So when the masters and the great saints come in, they really come in. And this was something it took me many years to understand about Swami Kriyananda. I always thought that he was joking. I don't know how else to put it, But the prison, he had to eat the same prison food, and it was just as tasteless to him as it was to anyone else. But he understood what attitude to have toward it, and he saw it differently. And that's not a sufficient answer at the moment. But so what happens is with these masters is that time and space and the material world are no boundary to them. They'll live in a body for a time, but their consciousness they never identify with their limitations, and they have the capacity to be everywhere at the same time. For us, for me, this is a theory, but not a fact. I have to fight to remember. They never don't know. They still have to struggle with the conditions, but they know what they're doing. They don't lose ground the way we do. But what happens with the master, I don't think that was all very clear, but we'll try to clarify it now. What happens with the master is what they are primarily is a broadcast. Whether they're in a body or out of a body, what they are primarily is a broadcast. And it's a broadcast that is put out impersonally, just the same way that wherever the radio tower, or however that works, broadcasts, there's nothing personal about the broadcast in the sense of, I'm going to talk to, Joan over there who's really nice, but I'm not going to talk to Henry over here who I don't like as much. I don't like the weather in Arizona, so I'm going to broadcast only to Southern California. It's not like that. It's that it just goes out. and it goes out, you might say, in the 360-degree radius, equal power everywhere. And how it's received, even what is received, entirely depends on the instruments who are interested enough to attune. And when Swami was talking about sectarianism, we have been in this we were in actual litigation, but we've been in this theological disagreement with SRF, the organization Yogananda founded, since the beginning of time, because they claim to own the broadcast. And Swami says, even if you have the biggest radio, you don't own the broadcast. The broadcast is there for anybody who wants to tune into it. Now, most people are simply tuned into something else. It's just as simple as that. And that's why we all look so different. I mean, because we're tuned in on really many different levels. And that's why people have such different values about things. I wrote a book about 10 years ago of people's experiences with Swami Kriyananda, and one of them was, one section I believe is called First Impressions. And it was stories of people when they first met Swamiji. And Krishnadas Lacicero, he met Swami in Houston, Texas, I believe. And he was so magnetized by his first experience of Swami Kriyananda. He actually tells this story about he couldn't leave. He literally couldn't leave. Every time he looked to the exit door, he said it looked like this huge black cavern that was just going to eat him up. And when he looked back to where Swami was, who was still in the room, it was all bright light. And he went toward the light and has stayed there ever since. But he also talked about the fact that when Swami stopped talking, he said people got up and walked out of the auditorium. And he couldn't understand why they were walking out. Why would they leave? Because the lecture was over, the evening was done. And as far as they were concerned, they were going to now tune to another program and go do something else. But for him, it just was unthinkable. He just couldn't leave. And actually, by the end of the weekend, he was moving into an ashram. I mean, it just was like, that's how it happened. But the broadcast was the same for everyone. Like nothing, Swami had been exactly the same to every person, but every person in the room took it the way they were going to take it. And that's what's going on all the time, because time and space, physical, material, none of that affects the emanation, the divine emanation. It's really a magnificent meditation to visualize the gurus on this altar. If your devotion has not got a specific form, you can think of Divine Mother, you can think of Divine Light, however it is to you. Think of it in all these words that we use: infinite, eternal, unchanging, ever conscious, just these words that are very hard to really understand, but at least they point in the right direction. And just imagine it always. Storm, sun, war, peace, prosperity, disaster. It's unaffected, it's unconditional, it's constant. And the message gets translated into all sorts of specifics depending on the radio, how you receive it and what you can receive. And I'll talk more about this in a few minutes. But the essence of it is a very simple message. You are bliss. You are one with the infinite. Well, I think that's about it. And everything else is confusion because they're static in our attunement. But it's constantly there. And we just have to we move in and out of it. But it doesn't change. And actually, we don't change. We just move in and out of it. I was never because I left civilization, so to speak, in 1971 and lived for more than a decade without even electricity. So I just missed this huge, enormous part of popular culture and never went back into it. However, I'm not stupid, I know a little. But I remember the Star Trek part, where they had that, where they could teleport you in one way or another, and you would go, I'm sure it must look so funky now, but it was really advanced at the time, where you went to wherever the particular room was on the ship, and you stood in a particular place. Beam me up, that was the word. I was trying to write the word, because there was a beam. But you had to go there, and you had to stand in it, which is actually a really interesting point of view. I always wondered, what if your arm was outside, I don't know if they ever made a plot of what happened if you reached over because you dropped your car keys, and so that part of you didn't go. But you put your whole physical form into this light, and then it would be shifted. I'm sure the science is pretty obvious. They just dematerialize you and rematerialize you. But it would only happen if you stood in the beam. And you could stand right next to the beam, because whoever's running the levers was right here, but he wasn't in the beam. And everybody looks just the same, but you're either in or out of the beam. And it's a very simple image. And it's very helpful to take these just overwhelmingly gigantic concepts and get them down to something that you can actually get, because otherwise we just confuse ourselves. So if you're in the beam, then everything matches the beam. That's how that teletransportation, whatever it is, that's how it worked. Everything aligns, and then it can be shifted. And so it is with us. The broadcast is always happening, and the broadcast is always awakening us, I think is actually the right word, because it doesn't change us. It's not like we don't become something we're not already. We just wake up to what we are, because we start listening to the right station, because the rest of the time we're listening to other stations. Like when I was 19, don't think about yourself, but what else is there to think about? That's all I've been thinking about since I was born. Swami tells this charming story about his cousin and her daughter, and the little girl was about 4 or 5, and she said, "Mommy, what do you think about all day?" "Oh, I think about you children and what you need, and I think about Daddy, and I think about the house and what we can do for dinner." And the little girl said, "Oh," she said, "I only think about myself." And then she just ran away. And that's what little children are like. A lot, not all of them, but many. They only think about themselves. And it's very distressing to some parents to discover how utterly selfish their children are. And I don't mean they haven't advanced to the point of being selfish. They just assume that mommy and daddy are there to serve them. I mean, what else would you be doing except taking care of me? I mean, that's part of the way the whole system works. They're not even selfish, that's just the reality that they know. No, there's no other reality. But the other message, yes, there's one more message from that constant light, which is you are a part of a greater reality. And your separateness is an illusion. And the degree to which you affirm your separateness, you get to suffer. And the degree to which we recognize that we are part of this greater reality, to that degree we move in strength and power and freedom and courage, because we're not always afraid. Because if we're part of a greater reality, it's all happening in harmony. We're part of it all. So in our present societal stage of civilization, where we see these just constant outbreaks of violence and insanity, there's really no other word for it, it's very easy to move out of the beam of I am bliss, I am divine, I am in charge, there is divine intelligence here, into the beam of, oh my God, what's going to happen to me? But if I am part of a greater reality and everything is happening in harmony with that higher intelligence, and if I can see it from the right perspective, that doesn't mean that there won't be individual suffering. You have to also understand, what is the beam saying? The beam is not saying, it's all going to come out just the way you want it. See, that's another program that we listen to. And right now, the strongest program going on is, if you can get it for yourself, why not grab it? Just like that. That's the program that's just beaming everywhere. it's really just up to you. Just take it. There's no God. There's no greater reality. There's no standing values. People who believe in those things are just crazy fanatics. If you can get it for yourself, why not just take it? And everything in our culture is increasingly emphasizing that point. It's a very, very strong broadcast. So to be able to hold ourselves to hear something else, and I've always been impressed that the book of answered prayers that Master wrote, Whispers from Eternity, and you wished he'd called it, like supersonic blasts from the other side or something like that, but he used the word whisper, because the other side of it is that all the other broadcasts are much louder. It's just the way the game is played, for reasons I don't know. The divine whispers are very, very subtle. So you have to commit yourself to that station, and you have to hold your station there, because the wind and the noise and the force of everything else is constant, absolutely constant. And don't for a second underestimate its power to suck you off. That's the satanic force. People don't like that. That's the devil. And the devil will make you do it. I mean, you can think of it in any form that you want to, but it's like there's a preset that pulls you toward that. And it sounds so much louder and so much more convincing and so much stronger. And of course it's true that out of 1,000, one seeks. Because it just doesn't even occur to people that underneath that cacophony, there's this very soft, beautiful note. Very soft. And the weird thing is that what is day to the worldly man is night to the yogi. It's flipped. So all the power appears to be in the wrong thought. But the real power is in the divine thought. I really don't know how this is going to play out, but this is one of the things that's happening at the moment, is Ananda is partnering with some very well-respected, capable individuals in Delhi, and we're going to be working with them to help create this institute. I don't know what they're calling it, Institute of Living Wisdom or whatever they call it. But these individuals in India also work on the American side with very high-level academics in some of the best universities around here, because that's the world they're in. They're very impressed with Ananda, and they're very impressed with the quality of what we have to bring. Of course, our subject matter is right spiritual living. We're doing what we're doing. But I love the idea of very high-level people in this country hearing about us from someone from another country, because to say they've never noticed us is, I can't think of how to say it less than that. We're absolutely meaningless to the people who have power in this country. We are less than nothing. But Jesus' life ended badly too, you may remember. And it didn't go so well for his disciples either. But who remembers anybody from that time? And the ones that are remembered are only remembered in relationship to Jesus. Because what is the real power of creation? So that all that comes down to, and all that is very important. I mean, we ask the question, how do we have faith? How can we tell? How can we tune in? One has to really spend enough time getting an idea of all the mental citizens that are at war within us. Because if we just allow them to just express without our having any idea what's motivating them, they'll persuade us in countless ways. So I personally have found as a technique of living that I try to get very simple, very clear ideas in my mind as to what I'm trying to do and what it looks like. Not complicated ones, but simple ones. The broadcast is always happening. It depends on what my radio is tuned to. The message of the broadcast is really simple. I'm either in the beam or I'm not in the beam. So that when the extremely clever false reasoning starts in on you, because what false reasoning does, it persuades you that you have to take it seriously. That's how it works. It's not so stupid as just to scream in your ear. It offers you an extremely reasonable idea that really should be considered. But what happens is, when you start doing that, you've just basically changed the station. And now you're thinking of all the reasons about why it isn't true, and why it isn't going to work, and why I'm really not good enough, and why I really have to be practical, and who knows anyway. I mean, there you go. You know what it's going to sound like. So I find it very helpful to get very clear. Because the biggest obstacle to really being able to listen correctly and discern what's true is clarity. Just being clear inside myself. What is the objective here? You know, what is the purpose of my life? And am I living it? How do I measure it? I love to think about my life review. I'm not I'm not morbid, but death has always been of great interest to me. And I love to think of my life review. Because in my life review, it all's gone, just poof. It's all over. The whole thing is over. And all that's left is your consciousness, who you've become. And there's a wonderful death and return story. It used to be called Return from Tomorrow. I don't know what they call it now. I think they changed the name. It's by a Dr. Ritchie, Ritchie. If you haven't read it, it's really one of the best ever. So he dies of influenza in World War II when he was stationed somewhere in Texas, I think. And he gets sucked over to the other side, and he's 21 years old, and he hasn't even had a chance. And he gets confronted by Jesus, because that was his context. The Savior, he called him in his southern accent. The Savior was there. And he keeps saying to the Savior, it's not fair to judge me yet. I haven't had a chance. I'm just a kid. I've just begun. And the Savior keeps asking him, how much did you love? And the answer to that was not very much. And he's looking at his whole life, and his mother died young. His grandparents were jealous of the woman that his father married, and his grandparents poisoned him against his stepmother. And he was just a nasty boy through the whole thing. He was never good. And he was responsible. He was a child, but he had his whole consciousness, and he didn't love very much. And he was pretty embarrassed in front of Jesus. And my favorite part of the story is his whole life is playing out in 360 degrees around him. From coming out of his mother's womb, really literally. From his birth, he could see his birth, he could see his death. It was all playing simultaneously. And all of it was an embarrassment to him, because he'd just been a selfish, sort of nasty boy, except that he was an Eagle Scout. And so he describes how he kind of tried to block a lot of it and point out the part where he was an Eagle Scout, just like hoping he could hide the worst and point out the best. And he said he immediately realized that Jesus read it. And then he says, the Savior was amused, is how he puts it. The Savior was amused at my trying to fool him. And he said in that point he just surrendered. But also, when he realized that Jesus was amused, he also realized, what am I afraid of? Because that beam is a beam of love. That beam is a beam of acceptance. So he stepped into it, and then the rest of the story is the rest of the story. But I like to think about that. I really seriously, again, these are simple things. If I'm standing in front of the Savior, whatever form he takes for me, what's going to matter at that point? And what's going to show up that I'm going to be ashamed of? Keep it simple. Just get it as simple as you can do it, and then practice that with as much faith as you can, because it takes time. You've got a lot of, we've all got a lot of preset stations, and they keep grabbing the signal, even when we're trying. All right. I'm going to give us a short break. I've become very attuned to that red light. Some very dear friendships to me have been challenged when that red light's not on. I've learned to love. When I did I think it was the Mahabharata, 4 weeks of the Mahabharata, this was the audio tape, cassette tapes. And this was 4 weeks of classes, 8 hours of telling the Mahabharata. And they liked to keep my class on one tape. So they didn't record the last 20 minutes of the whole Mahabharata because it would have been a second tape. Yeah, that was a challenge to unconditional love. Finally, we just re-recorded it. I just told it again, but I couldn't believe it. You just didn't put on another tape? Well, it seemed like a good idea at the time to you, I guess. Not to me. Not now. Okay. No, now we're ready. Okay. Take your, if you don't mind, Catherine.
Can you talk about when you moved from the village here and to Palo Alto and what that was like and how you worked on your attunement after you had to come here?
That's a very good question. Catherine's referring to my life, which she knows, which is when I was 23, almost 24, 1971, June 1st. I moved to Ananda village. Actually, I believe I lived in San Francisco at that point. I've only really lived here in Palo Alto and at Ananda village since I was 18, virtually. And so I lived at Ananda village for 16 years. It's a rural community, still is a very rural community. For much of those 16 years, it was extremely isolated. For most of those, it was primitive. No electricity, no access to media, no interest in the world outside is really the best way to say it. It was really a forest ashram. And we had no money, and we didn't have cars, and we just rarely even left. It was heaven on earth. Impossible to replicate, but just fabulous. But in addition to everything else, it was country living. Just taking quite apart from ashram living, it was country living. And I've just spent almost 3 months in a house right in the same, a few miles from where I always lived. And I was doing country living again. And I really remembered what country living is. Wild turkeys and deer and geese and sunsets and sunrise and moonrise and quiet and psychic quiet. So when I became quite enamored of country living. And so coming here to Palo Alto, where I still live, was an assignment. It was an assignment that I didn't volunteer for, but I saw it was my assignment, so I accepted it. But it wasn't like, oh, I think this would be just what I would really love to do, is to drive up and down El Camino, and completely lose track of the phases of the moon, like this'll be fun. I didn't really see it like that at all. I actually kind of saw it as a nightmare. And when we first came here, there was no community, and we lived in a little house on what is actually Colorado Avenue, just a few miles from here. I don't know, people do this horoscope, which is geographic. I mean, my horoscope is like all my planets are like within 3 miles of each other. I just sit right here. I just live right here. And for 30 years now, so it's been a really long time. And I remember being in that house, and it was a rented house, and so the landlord took care of the lawn. I remember waking up and looking out my picture window, and somebody I didn't know was about 5 feet away from me mowing the lawn. And it absolutely unnerved me. And I mean, that's just like, what could be more common than something like that? But I'd lived in a community where I always knew everyone around me, and anybody especially who came into my aura was a kindred spirit. I knew the names of their children, and their mother's name, and that the father had just had a heart attack. I mean, there was no strangers. And suddenly there were strangers. And there were strangers whose consciousness I didn't necessarily want to absorb. And to make it a little worse, Swami Kriyananda was still living at the village, and I was living here. So pretty much I cried for 2 years. And every time he came to visit, which thank you God, he came very often and would stay in our house, and so I didn't lose touch with him. Every time he would leave, it would take me days to recover, just this sense of overwhelming grief. And every time I drive up and down the street, which was like a country road compared to what it is now, it was just agony for me. And then one day, and it took me longer than it should have, at the same time, I poured myself into what we were doing here. Some of you were present at that time, and I didn't hold back the fact that I was inwardly struggling. I didn't hold back. But then one day I realized, if I asserted my own will and took what I wanted and got to go home, which is how I thought of it at that time, I wouldn't be happy. Because asserting your own will and getting what you want doesn't make you happy. And I suddenly realized that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I didn't have any questions about that, fortunately. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. And if I went against my own dharma, what a crazy illusion that would make me happy. And so then I realized that I simply had to find happiness where I was sitting. And I began to shift my way of thinking. My friend Keshava, who is married to Daya, and they live in Delhi, and they've lived in India now for about 12 years. He's Canadian, she's American. He's also lived in Italy. He's been in a number of countries. I said, how do you do it there? And perfect answer, which I wished I'd learned earlier. He said, I never make comparisons. It was such a simple idea, isn't it? I never make comparisons. My friends told me, and I don't even know if this is true, but when Ananda started in Italy, it started with Americans, and gradually over time, the balance shifted, and the Americans went somewhere else, and it became run by Italians, and mostly Italians, but Europeans. And somebody told me that as long as there were so many Americans, there was always an undercurrent of complaint, because Italy doesn't run as efficiently as America runs. But as soon as the Americans weren't there to compare it to America, the Europeans just saw it for what it was. And what station are you listening to? So when I realized that I was where God wanted me to be, and because you see, it was so easy to justify my preference. See, this is how, if you want to think about it, if you want to call him Satan, I love the phrase, you must understand me correctly. One of my favorite phrases is, the devil made me do it. Because it nicely explains it. I did it, but I did it under the influence of someone who didn't have my best interests at heart. So I've worked my way around to phrases like that, which you could find abhorrent from the point of view of self-realization, to understand it's actually true. The devil made me do it. The devil made me discontent, because it worked very much in the interest of darkness for me to be unhappy. Because being unhappy is what darkness is, and I had this divine work to do. And if I was divided, then I wouldn't be able to do it as well, would I? I would always be crashing and burning and wishing and holding back and wondering and wanting. But it all made great sense to me, because especially then, it was very easy for me to point out why I had left this atmosphere for the atmosphere I'd been living in. It was extremely easy for me to point out why everything flowed better for me, that I was happier, that I was a much nicer person, that it was better for me spiritually. I mean, the reasoning was impeccable. Now, I was very safe because Swami had asked me to come here. So my pole star had sent me here. But if I had ever said to him, I can't do this, ever, I would have been pulled out in a second. But between wishing it were different and saying, I can't do this, there was a big space that I always had to work my way through. So there's a very subtle kind of spiritual test, which is actually my favorite, where you're actually right. And you get to have that with other people too. They really are wrong, and you really are right. It's just not relevant. It's just not relevant. And then it gets to be even more delicate, because being right isn't the point. Being in tune is the point. And so if this is what is asked of me, even if it's a sacrifice, Swami Kriyananda just talks about a lot of things that he had to say. I have this assignment from my guru, Yogananda, to make this happen, and it will put me at risk in all these different ways. He had to defy all his guru bhais. He had to take on a life that was completely unsuitable for a monastic to take on. He just had to do all these things, but there was a higher point of view, which was that Master had asked him to do it. And as long as that was true, then he had to assume that all the rest of us would sort itself out. And the fact that he could be right on all this on this level, it wasn't the level from which the decision was being made. And that's where it gets really exquisite, because you're so right, just so completely right. And God doesn't give a damn. So I find it helpful to acknowledge that I'm right, and then go from there. And now, how do you feel that? I mean, it's just such an obvious question. How do you feel that? You feel it by getting it wrong over and over and over again. That's the only thing I can say. If you don't have the courage to crash and burn, you'll never learn. If you can't play it safe. You just have to go out there and see what happens. And the first rule, I mean, I'll say the most important about 100 things, is that you have to have the humility to pay attention. When Swami Kriyananda was like in his early 30s, he was part of Self-Realization Fellowship in Los Angeles. They sent him to India to be in charge of the work there. He took on this very bold plan, which is he was going to build a temple to Master in the city of New Delhi. And in 1958, India had been a country for 10 years, and Prime Minister Nehru was still in charge of the country. Land in New Delhi was completely controlled from the national level of government. It was the capital. So for him to put a temple there, he had to get Prime Minister Nehru himself to authorize a piece of land for the temple like this. It was very bold. In the end, he succeeded. But because of karma, the board of directors in Los Angeles thought it was the craziest thing they ever heard of, and they absolutely refused to let him go forward. And eventually he was thrown out of SRF because of it. Thank you, God, because we wouldn't be sitting here otherwise. But he told that story multiple times over 15 or 20 years. It was just part of the culture of Ananda. It's all of it in my book. If you're curious, when the book is published, you'll read it. And then once he just casually mentioned, I didn't really actually feel Master blessing the project. He said, I didn't feel his approval, but I couldn't think of what else to do, and I thought it would be a good experiment to see what would happen if I went forward without that feeling. Just so casually. And he found out. But it's like he wanted to know. Like, usually I operate this way, what happens if I operate that way? And so he learned the difference. I mean, now it all had to happen, but just even that simple statement, I just tried it. And many times in his life, he would, if he didn't have absolute clarity, he would still put out energy. And so you just, even if you're not certain, because otherwise what happens is, you sit there like that, just waiting for it to become clear. But it's kind of hard to get much information when you're like this. And sometimes the reason, when I came to Ananda, I came because of Swami Kriyananda, but I was really devoted to Ramakrishna. And I didn't have much understanding of Yogananda. But I knew I needed to be where Kriyananda was. So it didn't add up. The whole thing didn't add up very well. But the reason I couldn't tell what God wanted me to do was because I didn't have enough intuition to know. So I needed more intuition to know what I should do. So how do I get more intuition? Do I sit there like this and just wait for intuition? It's just like, this is the problem. This is why I don't have intuitions, because I'm all just holding on and so afraid of making a mistake. But once you start doing things, the phrase that we always use at Ananda is energy has its own intelligence. Once energy starts flowing, then you begin to grow, things begin to happen, and you can see it from a new perspective. So I just said, basically, I said to Ramakrishna and to Yogananda, you guys figure it out. I mean, I really did. I said, I don't really know what's happening. I know that I should go where Kriyananda is, period. End of story. And there's this disciple and this and this. I just don't know. I said, you guys figure it out. And then I went forward as if I was clear. And I gave my whole heart to it. Same as when I was here, even if I was unhappy about being here. And as a consequence, I grew. And as I grew, then all of a sudden, oh yeah, of course, this is where I belong. Everything just came together. But it never would have if I had hesitated to act because the guidance wasn't clear. And that's what Swami was saying when he went ahead and did the temple in Delhi, which was, there was no other door open, and doing nothing was not going to bring any result, so he did the best that he could see. God is no tyrant. And then you begin to be able to tell the difference. You just can begin to feel from the results, and it's very sensitive. This is a whole question called intuition, which I have audio recordings about that subject, which is very worth understanding. Because the mere fact that it doesn't work doesn't mean that you were wrong. And the mere fact that it may work doesn't mean that you were right. It's more subtle than that. It's a question, it's just a question of the vibration. And it takes a lifetime to do it. I mean, some people are born more intuitive, but it doesn't, it can be acquired by a sincere desire. But the sincere desire is not, the sincere desire is to do the right thing. You know, that's what we have to be committed to doing the right thing. And the right thing meaning, I am part of a greater reality. And I am also part of that greater reality. The right thing is that which just begins to bring light. You know, everywhere. I have another question that was asked, and let me just say one more thing. I was getting my hair cut yesterday with this, woman who cuts my hair, and our relationship is that I go in every so often and she cuts my hair. I don't really know her beyond that, but the women especially know you tend to chat with whoever's cutting your hair. And it just, I was talking about the fact that right now in Chela Baba, in the house I live in, it's full of people. We are Stanford Hospital Auxiliary right now. We always are Stanford Hospital Auxiliary, but some of you know that one of our dear friends just had to have a tumor taken out of her brain. So we have a lot of people in the house who are all helping her. And I was just telling her these things. And she was impressed, Sort of like I look at her like, this a young woman has a brain tumor. I'm going to do anything I can to make it work for her. But I just ended up saying, there's a lot of really awful things going on in this world right now. And like as one person, it's very hard to push against the whole nation. But in my little sphere, if I can reach the top of whatever I'm capable of doing, then that is not a small contribution. And that's our guideline. We should all just try to be at the top of what we're capable of doing. It requires humility and self-honesty. And I say humility because we can only reach the top of what we are capable of doing. Because if you sacrifice yourself in an inappropriate way, then you are not acting as if you are part of all that is. You are acting as if everything else is important to God, but not me. And that is no more true than being more important than everyone else. So we just have to ask, what can I give? Someone asked me the question during the break, what does it mean to love? Love is a very interesting word. It's not a sentiment. Swami actually defines, he says, love is bliss in action. which is just a very interesting definition that I've only really just seen it recently, so I don't really have that much yet that I understand it. But love is, let me phrase it this way. The object of the spiritual path is not to be nice. Being nice is not the same as being spiritual. Being loyal to truth, that's what spirituality is. And being loyal to truth, sometimes people don't think you're very nice. But if you're loyal to truth, you are always acting for the highest good that you are able to understand and to reach for. And that's what everybody is doing. I remember this man who was a unity minister, and he was working on some huge anti-war something or another. He assumed that I would want to be part of that, and through me, Ananda would want to be part of it. I said, I don't know. Some people really have a destiny to be a soldier. What can I say? That their highest, the best good they can do is to discipline and train themselves. This is ideal, and sacrifice even their very life to protect that which they believe in. Now, if you're not worried about death because you have reincarnation and you're only thinking about your life review, I can't necessarily stand up and say that that soldier shouldn't do it. I can say that I shouldn't do it. There's just no way that I could do it, but for him or her, it might be a forward step. So what we always have to look at, and this is all that God wants of us, given the context of who I am and what I'm capable of, one of Swami's wonderful compliments that we all just get a good laugh out of is, how am I doing, sir? You're doing very well, considering who you are. Which he actually said. Not to me, but to someone else. But considering who you are, you're doing really well. But a lot of times, we want to be better than we are. And we have a very hard time realizing this is my best. And that, I remember, this was in my early 30s, I had to play this whole one out. Well, this was part of the schizophrenia of my upbringing. But I always thought that there was a far better version of me. And if I just kept being really unkind to the one that seemed to be dominant, and just kept sort of berating her all the time, then finally she would say, ha ha, and she would open the closet, and the other one would come out, and then I would have that one. And there was this really important, virtually one day, when I realized this is it. This is actually it. There is no better one than this one. That's huge. And therefore, there's no point in constantly being upset because I've set an impossible standard for myself and missed it. That it's not that I've missed the standard, it's that I am so egoic that I'm not able to recognize that most of us are just mediocre, and that's what we are. We're just, we're not bad. I developed a mantra at that point. It's a crazy mantra. I'm a pretty nice person. Because I am a pretty nice person. I'm not a real nice person, but I'm a pretty nice person. And, I'm good-hearted. But if I expect something of myself that I'm not, then I get to lose and be unhappy all the time. So truth is what we have to be going for, always. We have to be going for what's true, and then given what's true, then we have to understand. Like right now, there are people sleeping in my living room, and I still have a private bedroom. And I actually thought, do I give my bedroom to someone else? I said, no. If I was in the living room, I wouldn't be able to do this. There are people who need places to stay, part of this whole hospital extension. If I gave up my bedroom, then there would be more room in the house. But I can't do that. I'd like to be able to. I can see it as a wonderful place to get to, but I'm really not there. I'm using a very concrete example because you can all understand exactly where that is. Can I empty my bank account? No, I can't. I'd like to be able to go to a restaurant. I need to be able to spend that money. I need to be able to get in my car. It'd be nice if I didn't. I'd like to be free enough, but I'm not. So when we're loving other people, which is where the question was, you have to recognize that in the eyes of God we are all equal, meaning I am not less or more. And if my need is real and his need is real, I just have to think about what is possible here. But also, merely because people want something from you does not mean that it's a good idea to give it to them. And I mean, if you think of parents and children, it becomes so obvious. If a parent always just does what the child wants, the parent raises a crippled child. So is that love? And the clearest understanding of human relationships is mother love. And in the West, of course, mother love it just doesn't exist. The ideal of feminine love is sexual. You know, the concubine is really the ideal of feminine love in America. In India, it has been. I don't know if it still is, but mother love is the ideal. But mother love is how we should, male or female, that's how we should think of ourselves. Because mother love has the courage, has the selfless giving, the best interest of the person at heart, but also has the courage to stand by what's true. I mean, that's the ideal of it. And then, you know, I hate you, mother. You're the most terrible mother in the world. Well, that's just too bad, honey. You're still not going to be able to do it. Because I'm not in it for myself. I'm really in it for what's right for you. And in all our relationships, if we think like a mother, I mean, an ideal mother, of course. If you had one, that helps. But if you didn't, you can imagine it. Then you'll always know what to do. Or at least that's how I've seen it. And that's why, you know, Master was like a mother to many of the people there, because they could absolutely rely on his unconditional love and his holding their best interests at all times. And, you know, the reason we don't behave that way is because we get scared. And we just lose the thread. You know, okay, I'd said something earlier and I'll say it again. I like to reduce the concepts down so that they're very simple. The difference between simple and easy is enormous. But sometimes because it's not easy, we think it's complicated. But it's rarely complicated, it's just not easy. Because it's so not easy, we make it complicated because we just don't have the nerve. I had an experience which I've written up and you've heard it, but it's just like I was just in a tizzy about what God wanted, and it was just a constant, never-ending tizzy, and I had to make a serious decision, which was an either-or decision. And I just kept wanting to know what God wanted, and finally I realized, no, I didn't. I knew perfectly well what God wanted. I just wanted somebody else to answer me. I wanted a different answer. And I didn't have the courage to admit. I just was too afraid of what was going to happen. Now, in some cases, when that's happened to me in my life, I've had to say, I think I'll take option 2. I mean, but seriously, yes, I know that would be a good idea, whether it's a conversation with Swamiji or an inner conversation. Yes, sir, I know that would be a good idea. Yes, I know that's in my best interest, but we're not going to do it. Because we're just not big enough to do it. And the divine response is always, okay, where are we going to go now? And then my friend, in the Miracles and Answered Prayers book, he said, the first line of his story is, you might think it would be impossible to be a drug addict and a committed disciple of Paramhansa Yogananda, but I'm here to tell you both can be done at the same time. And that's just how he put it. He said, it'll be no surprise to you that my favorite expression of Master's is, if you're going to do it anyway, take God with you. He said, so I took Master to a lot of places I don't think he would have gone on his own. And I mean, the end of the story is that he broke out of all of that. But there was a long middle ground. Oh yeah, I know what you want, but I'm not going to do it, so you're just going to have to stick with me while we go on.
That's very helpful because it's so practical and it's doable. It's like you don't have to reach up to the sky. You start where you are. That's what I'm getting.
Well, it's like everybody's really interested in working out somebody else's karma. We just think that some karma other than mine would be more fun. Seriously. So we just spend a lot of time just creating a false persona and then trying to live up to that false persona, because life is boring and most of us don't have a very interesting destiny. I don't know how else to say it. I mean, we were born for greatness, but it's not likely to show. I mean, just like, really, how many people on the planet ever do anything that matters? I'm just being very realistic. And even people who do things that get them 15 minutes of fame, how much of it ever lasts? Swami Kriyananda, who was a prolific author, he was a bookworm. He loved to read. And for many years, Ramurti and Sita ran this huge used bookstore over on Castro Street, Book Buyers. Some of you may know it. Thousands of books. Whenever Swamiji would come, he would spend, he'd just love to wander through the shelves, and he would take books home. And then every so often he would say, as an author, it's a little depressing, Here he is writing and writing and writing, and here are these hundreds of just old books that nobody wants anymore, and authors who've been totally forgotten, and epic volumes that are just gathering dust. So it's just, that is the truth of it. Whatever destiny we have, it's just a minute like that. But how much we love is going to be with us for eternity. And if in the process of writing your book and choreographing your dance and doing your painting and raising your children, you also become who you're trying to become, then you get both. And that's the real story for us these days. Even if you just go off to a cave, then you get both. Because the way we become what we're trying to become, we have to be ambitious. It's really peculiar. None of it matters, and we have to act as if it all matters. Because if we don't dedicate ourselves to it, we won't discipline ourselves. And if we don't discipline ourselves, we won't grow. So, there was a point when I first came to Ananda, I prided myself on the fact that I was there for Swami Kriyananda. And yes, there was a community being built around me, but I didn't care about that. I was just there for self-realization, like this. And then I noticed that Swami Kriyananda seemed to care a lot about building the community. And somewhere in there it crossed my mind that I had come to learn from him because he was wiser than I, and he had a very different attitude toward this. And maybe this was always my theory, what are the chances that I'm right and he's wrong? And I could never really make that one way out in my favor. So if we were at odds, which many times we were because I was a very opinionated, strong-minded person, at one point, he was usually very patient with me. This is like 35 years into our friendship. I was disputing something he said, and this is the only time he ever really got impatient with me. He said, "You always agree with me in the end, so why don't you just be quiet and think about it?" And he was right, and I heard him. It took him 30 years to say that to me. But I realized that he was taking it very seriously, and I wasn't. And I really changed because I could just feel, it wasn't as clear to me then as it became, that there was something wrong with it. But of course, in this world, we do. It's a battle of light and darkness, and you have to put your energy on the side of light, or else you're on the side of darkness. You cannot be neutral. In our culture, in our civilization at this point, it's really polarizing. But within ourselves, we're either moving toward the light or we're shrinking away from the light. I won't go so far as to say we're moving toward darkness, but we're either growing or shrinking, because nothing ever stays the same. So you cannot just stake out a position and hang in there, because if you stop trying to grow, you will start shrinking. And growing, it just can be so tiny. It's just like, a woman told me her husband always just lets the milk boil over and doesn't clean the stove. And her sadhana became just to clean the stove. I said, "You've been married to him for like 35 years? How many times have you asked him to do it? What are the chances that if you say it one more time, he's going to do it?" So like, how mad do you want to be at him? And where is this going to take you? So her sadhana became, and she very proudly told me, She would just come in there every morning and just clean up the splattered milk. And it was a huge victory. You can see. But like on the great scale of history, who's going to know she was cleaning up the stove? But inside herself, and if your destiny is bigger than that, I had an assignment to write a book, which is just my job. I never raised children. I never had a home. I've never done anything like that. So I had to write a book. But writing the book was to discipline 1,000 wrong thoughts. I can't do it. I'm not good enough to do it. It's too hard. It's too much work. I need a break. I don't want to do this. Just make a list. Anybody can have a list. But it's nice. I think it's a good book. But even if it weren't, I did what was asked of me. And I succeeded, I say against great odds, because the odds were myself, but I succeeded against great odds. And I feel justifiably quite chipper about the whole thing. But that's the reason I feel chipper. And yes, also now that this book exists, it's like a child now that that's gotten married and gone off on its own. I have no relationship to it. I have very little personal relationship to it. It's done. I think it's good. I'll publish it. I think people will really like it. I'm really happy. But the project was me. And that's why he assigned it to me, because he knew it would work. And he wouldn't have assigned it to someone else because it wouldn't have served them. So whatever is in front of you, however you phrase it, however horrible or beautiful it looks to you, it's only given to you because if you face into it correctly, you will become who you're supposed to be. And there's no mistakes. It's so annoying. There's no mistakes. It just annoys me so much. There are no mistakes. I really want it to be somebody's fault. This time, I say, this time, it is their fault. And sometimes I just kind of do that for a little while. Swamiji once excoriated me for some wrong action and attitude, and it was based on reports. When you live at Ananda, you're in a fishbowl and everybody knows everything. It's just hopeless to pretend otherwise. And people had their direct relationship with Swami, so they would phone him or write him or send him emails, and then he would decide what was needed. But on one of these occasions, he decided that something needed to be said and scolded me very strongly. Excoriated is the word I want to use. But Swami was always, he was always very refined, extremely refined. So if he spoke strongly, it was still elegant and tasteful. But it was definite. And a few days later, I was visiting in Assisi. A few days later, I said, all your facts were wrong. And he said, oh, I know. Just like that, oh, I know. He said, but if such a wave of energy could even get started, then you have a problem that you have to solve. But it was just so fun. Oh, yes, of course, I knew all my facts were wrong. That wasn't the issue. Facts were not the issue. There was a vibration that needed to be corrected. And so, let's correct it. That's why, really, regardless, it wouldn't come to you if it wasn't yours. And it doesn't hurt to know that all the facts are wrong. And then after you've satisfied yourself that all the facts are wrong, then you have to ask, how come this is happening? What's in it for me? What am I supposed to do? And what I say to myself is, I never want to see this karma again. And so I don't really care who's right and who's wrong. I don't ever want to see this again. So what do I need to do never to see this again? So if you're caught in a work situation, if you're caught in a home situation, if your children are lemons, sometimes they are, whatever it might be. If you don't like it, then what do I do about it? And someone also asked me, you go into the world, like right now, Dharma has so little value. You can't even begin to say how little value Dharma has. It just has no value. Nobody cares. Just, if I can get it for myself, I'll take it. Why wouldn't I be calculating my own position? Why wouldn't I be working to my own advantage? And really, really ugly things happen. So one has to just decide for himself. But it's very challenging. Swami wrote Material Success Through Yogic Principles. There's 26 huge lessons. about how to make your way in this world without compromising righteousness. And he wrote it because a doctor in India said to him, here I am in India. I have a son in college in Canada. He said, I have an enormous financial obligation to my family, and it's just like I can't quite earn the money I need unless I do things that are not quite honorable. Pad the bills, false tests, whatever. He didn't have to articulate it. And as Swami put it, he said, I could see in his eyes what a terrible conflict this was for him. And he said it was more intense there because there's a greater sense of realization of honor. In this country, as a culture, it's become honorable to be dishonorable. We are really a disintegrating civilization. This is what it looks like when civilizations collapse. This is what it looks like. So we just can't be shocked anymore. And it's not that Master said we're not really going under, but we're going to have some turbulent transitions here. So Swami wrote this whole course because it's not easy. And people who have really studied and absorbed that course, and we have all these testimonials, how their careers suddenly flourish. Because that's where the real power is. The power always comes from above. Even if the demons seem to have it for a while, spirit is much more powerful than matter. And someone asked Swami specifically about that course. I did also 52 lessons on that course. I called it Manifesting Through the Power of Yoga. It's an audio recording. And but someone asked him when he first brought that course out, what's the difference between your course, they were calling it on prosperity, and so-and-so's course, Tony Robbins, he did all these prosperity courses at that time. Swami's answer was so interesting. What's the difference between your course and this one? Swami said, I am the disciple of a great master. That was his answer. It's just like he sort of left it there. And I really thought about that for a long time. Because you see, when you're on the material plane, you start manipulating the material plane, and you see how this force plays against this one, and this plays against this one, and this plays against this one. When you're in the material plane, you see how the whole thing works from above. And you realize that this is just horizontal movement, but as a disciple of a great master, you're bringing to bear the power behind the power on the material plane. And when India was in tune with spirituality before the British came and everything else that happened, they were the wealthiest country in the world. People went to India because there was so much wealth, and then systematically took it and impoverished the country. But when they were in tune with spirituality, the material world also worked, because that's where it's run from. But, these are lifelong lessons. That's why we're here. So, now, any other questions, comments, or thoughts? Yes, we need a microphone in the back. Zara?
How do you know what your dharma is?
Well,
because you said,
yeah.
I came here, I was not happy, and then I found, okay, that's my dharma.
Right.
How do you know that?
Well, when someone asks Swamiji, how do you know what your dharma is? He says, well, if a job needs to be done and you're the next in line, that's how seriously he took the question, which was, sometimes he would give an answer like that because he would need to sort of break a myth that's in your head and kind of get you out of. It's a little bit complicated because very few people have a destiny that's going to show. Make an impact in the world in a big way. And even worse than that, most of us have so many different lessons to learn that we could learn them in any number of ways. I remember someone commented about, they were in a relationship with, this woman was in a relationship with this man, and it really was not going well, and it was not likely to go well, but she was extremely nervous that he might be the one, and that she was going to mess everything up if she didn't stick it out because he was the one. And Swami was trying to help her. Afterwards, he said to me, He said, you know, she has so many lessons to learn, she could learn it with any number of people. He said, you have to be very, very advanced before your karma is so simple that you really have only one thing left to do. So there's a tremendous tendency to think, I have to be in this circumstance in order to learn something. But the fact is, wherever you find yourself, it's at least your karma. Karma, dharma gets a little confused here. But the only way out of it is to learn what it has to teach you, which is to advance, to make it superfluous to your growth by mastering it. And then once you master it, then you will get your next set of lessons. But as long as you remain passive in the face of it, worrying about whether this is really my dharma, then it's the same as I was saying about not knowing whether I really belonged at Ananda. Nothing will happen. So look around and assume that whatever has been handed to you is your dharma, and get going, working on it. And if you have a very strong feeling that you're supposed to be doing something else, what happens, what I hear from people, especially, and I respect psychics and astrologers and past life readers and all those. I mean, all those things are very real, and people can really help you with that. But too often what happens is people will tell you of a potential, and that you will think that that potential is certain. And too often when you're told of a potential, or too many people, when they hear of a potential, rather than saying, okay, if that's where I want to go, what's my next step? They just think about the potential and lament that it isn't happening. But the potential is just that, unless you say, people will say, well, I'm supposed to be a healer. Well, what do you know about healing? What have you studied? What have you done? What courses are you taking? What healers do you know? Are you apprenticing yourself to this one? What books are you reading? What meditation are you doing? Very often the answer is this. The answer is just, I'm supposed to be a healer. So it isn't that big a question what our dharma is. The question is, what am I doing with what I have right in front of me? How can I creatively respond? And what I say to people most of the time, it really doesn't matter what you're doing as long as you're 120% engaged in it. If you're completely engaged in it, then it will lead you to wherever you're supposed to be. If you're not making use of what you have, why would God give you something else? It's really simple. If you give a child a pearl necklace, or you give your girlfriend a pearl necklace, and she says, I really never liked pearls. I mean, what are the chances that you're going to go out and buy a diamond? You're just not going to do it. And so if God gives you a copper chain that you have to work with, I don't want it, I don't want it, I don't want it. I want pearls, I want pearls, I want pearls. I mean, what are the chances? If you say, wow, that's beautiful, look at all the things I can do with this. I can decorate my house, I can give it to the children, I can melt it down and make it into a little horse. You just do all these different things, and then you're using what's given to you. That's the law of prosperity, use what's given to you. When I used to have to manage in one of my disastrous earlier professions, I had to manage this little business for a while. But my principle was I know you want something better than that, but what are you doing with what you have? Yes, I know there is a better tool than that tool, but you're not even using the tool you have. Use it to its maximum, then we'll buy another one. I mean, I understood that much. If you're not putting out energy, nothing will happen. So I've never found it fruitful to worry about what I'm supposed to be doing, because I figure if I do what and I've also seen it's a very simple dynamic, because I've lived in community for all these years, so I've watched it work. The person who says, I'm not really supposed to be a secretary, I'm supposed to be a healer, and then they're just a terrible secretary and totally unreliable and never creative, and they never do anything. Nobody's ever going to give them another job. They're just going to go downhill from there. But if your job is, David Gamma once, for some period of time, ran the Xerox machine. This man has a really big brain. He's a really strong, powerful man. And for several months, all he did was make copies at the Xerox machine. I don't really know how he ended up there, but that's what happened. But he just became the best darn Xerox machine operator. And as a consequence, he finished the karma and he got to go on. Plus, he manifested the fact that this is a person who will take on responsibility and do it. And that draws to you greater opportunity, rather than I should have more responsibility. Why isn't people giving it to me? Why aren't people? Simple principle. Does that help? And then after that, you use your common sense. If you love to sing, then try singing. If you love to sew, try sewing. If you love children, try teaching. Just follow your own natural inclination. It's not nearly as mysterious as people think. It's usually right in front of you. And if you just go with the flow, see what happens. And then have the courage to fail. And then every so often you get just a harebrained idea that makes no sense at all that you get to actually succeed at. Recently they dedicated this larger than life-size statue of Master up in Portland because one woman just decided it was supposed to happen and it was her destiny. About 5 years ago, no one took her seriously, but she knew it was true, and she did it. I mean, it was a really good example, but she just would not give up. And she didn't just say, it should happen. She said, I'll make it happen, and just went step by step right through it, and then there it was. Is that fair enough? Yeah. I find the first step is to recognize seriously that I may not really have a very interesting destiny. That's what I had to do. I've had a more interesting destiny since I decided I didn't have one. Because then I could put myself into whatever was in front of me. Well, I suggested to a friend that she should become an SSD, a simple serving devotee. Just think that my destiny is to be a simple serving devotee. And then wherever you are, just do that, and everything else follows. Well, should we take a little break again? Let's take another break. You all were pretty good with your break. Let's do it again. I had some questions during the break, but does anyone have anything you want me to talk about? We have 45 more minutes, so it's now or never. So, is there anything that I've really missed that needs to be said here? Yeah, I didn't really talk about creativity, and 2 of you asked about creativity. Also, I was asked several questions during the break, and they're really all basically the same question. And I really understand this question. I wish it were easier. I remember I sat in front of Swami Kriyananda once, and I just basically, I couched it differently than this. It was, I was having a meltdown, and I couched it differently than this, but this is what I actually said. Oh, it would be so much easier if it weren't so hard. I didn't know that's what I said, but that's what I said. This was his response. For those of you who are just hearing this, I mean, he had no expression. It was he just sat there. He just existed without any expression. And he just let what I'd said just sit in the room until I heard it. And what is he supposed to say to that? Oh, I'm so sorry. Is it difficult for you? Here, let me just wave a magic wand. And everybody else has to put out a lot of energy, but now you don't have to. Right. Everybody else has to face their own confusion and ignorance. But no, you don't have to. It's you. It's going to be easy for you. It's just like, what can you say to things like that? See, the problem with self-realization is it's really serious. I remember somebody who came here for a very short period of time said, everybody talks about overcoming the ego, but you all actually mean it. And it's like, I like to talk about these things, but are you serious? We're actually going to have to do this? It's like, yeah. And it's bloody difficult in the sense that once you really get the fundamentals, there's just no shortcut. There was a gentleman who doesn't live here anymore, who's a dear friend. Some of you may know his name, but I'm not going to say it out loud. But he was a very bright man, very sincere on the path, and for about 25 years he asked me the same question. Isn't there a shortcut? Just over and over again, in a very interesting, extremely entertaining, often quite humorous way, but it was always the same question. I would like it to be easier. Maybe you're holding back on me. Maybe if I ask you in a slightly other way, you'll tell me what you haven't told me before, which is that there's a shortcut. No, not actually, there isn't. And it's even worse than that, much worse than that. It's all your fault. It's all my fault. It's all our own doing. It's terrible. And everyone just wants it another answer than that. And in the sense that karma is always fair. You never find yourself in a position that you yourself didn't walk yourself into. I remember, even though you don't remember and you think how stupid I would have been to do this, it seemed like a good idea at the time. Or suffering, disappointment, disaster, and failure is not always the fact that God is displeased with you. Sometimes it's a fact that you are ready for the big time. Yeah, you've really moved from off-Broadway onto Broadway, and now you get to be the star of a really outstanding show because you have earned it. And so you get a challenge that looks so big that you don't think you have a chance of meeting it, and you get to fail sometimes for years. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're not right where you should be doing exactly what you should be doing. I had to deal with this because of this book, which, everybody's karma is different. So for me, this was very real. One of the reasons I finally believed that I could write, this is the 4th book I've written. Let's go back to the first one, 10 or so years ago. I realized that Swami Kriyananda and every single person I knew believed I could write a book. I was the only one who was absolutely certain that I couldn't. And I insisted on that point of view. And I finally realized that I was telling all these people that I love and respect that they were all wrong, and I was the only one who knew. And then something about that seemed a little wacky to me. And that was the beginning of just, I've spent decades with all these people, and I think they're pretty smart. And so the chances of them all being wrong and my being right, just forget the issue. And it sort of began to shift it a little bit. Now, what was the point? What was the point of that? And then I finally got to the point where I would die trying. That success or failure was less the issue, that I would die trying. Because somehow or another, I've gotten myself into this, and I could only see one way out of it, which was to not give up. And the number of times I failed, and frankly, how miserable I was, and any of those things, they were all interesting but not relevant. The only relevant point was that somehow I'd gotten myself into this. I had a very interesting, much smaller little box experience at one point. In the context of many years at Ananda, a person would go in and out of right attitude, and you could say in and out of being in tune, which is how we sometimes phrased it, but that's a somewhat of a confusing phrase. But I went through one of these cycles, and I got myself pretty crabby and isolated. And I was running a lot of not so nice tapes, and so because of that, I was gradually found myself very isolated and just not in sync with all the people that were my people, because I was always, the details escape me, but I would vary between criticizing others and criticizing myself. So whichever way it was going, I don't remember. But it was not fun. And I finally, this wasn't the moment it happened, but at one point Swami said to me, "How are you?" I said, "I don't know, sir. How am I?" And he said, "I'm a little concerned about you." I said, "Me too." It became a joke between us after that. He would always ask, "How are you?" And I said, "I don't know, sir. How am I?" And just like, how do I know? Just like I may have an opinion, but that doesn't mean I'm right. But I'd gotten myself way out. And then I started weeping and feeling guilty and feeling like a failure. It's not funny. I can make it light now, but it was not funny at all. Not even a tiny bit. But somewhere in the midst of all of that, it crossed my mind that I got myself here. I could get myself out of here. And I just sort of asked myself, what's not working? And I tried to start systematically. I was waiting for people to come to me. I was only willing to do certain things. I was critical of what everyone else was doing. I thought nobody respected my point of view. I mean, it was a big thing. But then and so I felt crabby toward everyone. Then I had to go into town for some reason. I don't even know why. And there was the grocery store, and I walked through like this, and at the end of the aisle I saw this couple that I didn't like at all, part of Ananda, but I just didn't like them. I had a real negative attitude toward them. You know how it is in a grocery store, you can pretend that you didn't see them? So I was pretending that I didn't see them like this, and I literally started to walk away. And I said, Asha, this is how you got in so much trouble. It's because you're always weighing, measuring, rejecting, everything. And so I literally made a U-turn. It was all nice and physical, so I made a U-turn. I came back, I walked down, I decided to love them. And I just did. I became, it's not hard to love people. You just stop thinking about yourself. How are your children? What are you doing? This man did music and this did this. I just asked him all these questions and I was genuinely interested in all the answers. Ever after, they eventually left the community, but there was always this really sweet bond between us after that. And I still didn't like them much. I just didn't care for their point of view and their way of doing things. But I got inside their reality. And it was just as simple as that. And then the next time and the next time and the next time, I just tried to think of what I could give instead of what I could get back. Because I knew I had gotten myself into it and I could get myself out of it. And so even in a cosmic way, if you find yourself paralyzed in a wheelchair, for some reason, that needs to be your starting point. And I'm not being glib about this. I visualize a lot of times the most terrible thing that could happen to me. What would I do? How would I move forward from there? And I figure you just look around. And if one thing doesn't work, Swami said prosperity is having a sense of infinite possibilities. Poverty is thinking that if one or two don't work, there are no other options. And so prosperity is an attitude of just, well, that didn't work very well, let me try something else. And, maybe you just have to keep going down the food chain. My peers are not interested in my point of view or my help. Maybe there's homeless people who need me. I mean, it's just like, you just keep trying until some kind of a door opens. And maybe all you can do is write nice notes and pray for people. I remember, I don't know what was happening, but I was making a necessary corrective, and I started writing a lot of letters of appreciation to a lot of people. And finally it came back, does she have terminal cancer? Well, I had terminal delusion, and I needed to correct it. So I started, it was accessible to me. I just started giving in the only way I could give. And people were just because, did you get a letter from her like that? Yeah, I got one too, Like what made her so nice all of a sudden? Well, because I realized that the consequences of not being nice were not working for me. I've never been tested physically. I have a strong body, and, you can point out all the ways that I haven't been challenged. And I don't know whether I could meet those challenges, but I've got the principle down. But inertia in itself is a huge force. And then if you start adding karma, chakras, vrittis, all the other things that you can study and learn, you get a picture of what it really looks like. But when you get a real clear picture of vibrations of consciousness in the chakras stored as whirlpools of energy, on one hand that looks kind of freaky, but on the other hand you realize it's just a whirlpool of energy. That's all we are, is just whirlpools of energy. If you're a murderer and you have a revelation of God, you become a saint in the morning. You become a saint who actually murdered somebody, but the only difference between being someone who murders and somebody who blesses is their state of mind. There's nothing inherent. You think about it. There's nothing inherent. It's just the vibration, the program you're listening to. And if the program you're listening to is not good, you have to try to figure out where does it start. And this is another very important part. Almost everyone wants dramatic, fast change. And they tend to try to go at something that's too big to conquer and then fail at it and then feel defeated. Whereas what we really have to do is so really boring, which is you have to clean up the milk that your husband has been boiling over on the stove for the last 35 years. Because that's your habitual response to life. And what the big, gigantic awfulnesses that we're living with are all created moment by our habitual response to life. And you can't, see, it's all energy against energy. And if you, for this whole incarnation, or for many incarnations, have been putting a penny into that jar over and over again, you can't even lift it, what to speak, to empty it out, but you can start putting pennies into this jar, think of it as a balanced scale, or you can also start taking pennies out, like this, but you can't just dissolve all that energy. It's energy against energy. So a woman came to me and she was just carried this stunning resentment against her mother, which was not unjustified. The whole horror story was a true story. Like, so, how's it working for you? And she wanted me to dissolve the karma. I said, well, do you have a tendency to resent? Oh no, just my mother. Which of course was not true. And we gradually worked it out that she basically resented pretty much everything that happened around her. And I said, well, start small. Start with your coworker who doesn't wash his coffee cup. Just cheerfully say, oh, how happy I am to wash his coffee cup. Isn't that nice that he's so busy thinking about his work, he doesn't have time to wash his coffee cup? And then I don't mind washing coffee cups. So-and-so cuts me off on the highway and we just say something extremely rude because we're alone in our car. And instead you say, oh my, I hope he doesn't get into an accident. He probably has children at home. Please, dear God, tell him that he's reckless. And you just start changing your habitual response. And the thing that is, if you're going negative, even though it feels like an easier way to go, you're actually going against the flow of the universe. And even if you're just doing something so tiny, like I turned around and went and talked to those people, those icky people that I didn't like very much. But as soon as I did that, I was going with the flow of the divine. And that's called the grace of God. And so where did this start? How do you get the power of the guru? You operate in a way that the guru is interested in helping you operate. It's like, he's just not particularly good. I remember somebody was going to do something really recklessly stupid. And he came to Swami and his response was, this man did not last long at Ananda. Well, if Master didn't want me to do it, he would stop me. And after he walked out of the room, Swami said, why would he? Why would Master answer a prayer like that? I'm going to do what I want, and if you don't want me to, then you can interfere. I mean, like, how magnetic is that? It has to be a real sincere desire inside of you. So once you open up with that sincere desire, God is so eager to make us happy. Those cartoons of the diving bell, where it goes down into the bottom of the sea, or the submarine movies, where there's a hole and the water tries to come in, those really cramped, dark movies with the hole in the water and everybody screaming. The fact of the matter is, the divine is pressing on us, trying to break through and uplift us. And we have to work so hard to hold that at bay. The pressure is all toward the positive, and we have to work really hard to maintain the negative. As Swami said to me, God does not want you to be unhappy. That's your imposition on the situation. And I had to think about that for a long time. So as soon as you do the smallest thing that's even sincere, even if misguided. This woman wrote to Swami once, and she had it was an either or choice. She said, I just keep praying and I don't know what Master wants. Swami said, oh, do either one, it doesn't matter. Master is pleased that you're asking. Because we think all these details matter, and all that God and Guru want from us is that we give the best that we're able to give. He doesn't really care whether we're a fashion model or a doctor, because most of us have so many lessons to learn that we can just about learn them anywhere. And it's not what we're doing, but how we're responding. And if we find ourselves constantly defeated, which we do, you just have to keep trying. There's just literally no other answer. I'm at the end of a 50-year saga in my own life, nearly 50, not quite. And the only thing I can say, and the only virtue I can claim, is I didn't give up. And so, if you don't give up, you will succeed. And if you die trying, you will succeed. And there's no shortcut, because whatever is pulling you in the wrong direction, you put every one of those pennies in the jar, and it seemed like a good idea at the time. Phooey. But self-realization is blissful, but it's a hard taskmaster, because it just takes away all your excuses. But it's all right to say, well, Master, eventually I'm going to give up drugs, but not yet, so I hope you're going to enjoy this evening. You just do what you have to do until you get better. That whole story, which is in Miracles and Answered Prayers, I don't know what it's called or where it is in the book, but that particular man, I think he puts his name on the story, but I'll just let you find it. He said he was absolutely at his lowest ebb. He was somewhere out in the woods, all by himself, just stoned or whatever he was doing. And he just suddenly hit bottom, and he said, God, you've got to help me. And he really meant it. He said he was suddenly surrounded by policemen who arrested him. Yeah, he said he was in the middle of nowhere by himself. And when he prayed like that, minutes later, he was surrounded by policemen with guns and lights on him. I mean, he wasn't a violent criminal. I mean, the whole thing was so out of proportion. Even he said, just thought, wow, that was fast. And then that was the beginning of the turnaround. Stories like that are important. Yes, go ahead.
No, I have a question related to Swami. In these past 3 weeks, you finished the book. Did you feel closer to him? Did you feel anything unique in the process of writing the book, and especially finishing it, that you can share?
Oh, yes. I think the answer to all that is very giant, like golden letters of light, yes. And that's, I haven't addressed that, so let me address that for a minute. Let me think about this for a minute. It's one thing to say that death is not an obstacle for people of expanded consciousness to communicate with us. I listened to Swami. Swamiji was not yet 26 when Master died. He'd been with Master for 3.5 years. Master was only 60 years old, and right in front of his eyes, in front of the eyes of many, Master just went into Mahasamadhi, totally unexpected. So I've only ever known, all of us have only ever known Swami Kriyananda after Yogananda died. And he constantly would, Yogananda was a living presence and a living guiding force. So most of the time, I wouldn't even really remember that he just had a tiny period of time. Jesus' disciples were with him for 3.5 years. All of the main disciples of Ramakrishna were with him from 3 to 5 years. He didn't even bring them till the end of his life. So a lot of times these relationships with the masters are not at all what we think they are. And to say that there's a living presence is one thing. To actually get into a flow of energy in which time and space are not an obstacle is really something else. I mean, Jesus would come to St. Teresa in her cell and they would chat. Francis walked around with Christ all the time in physical vision. I certainly can't even begin to claim anything like that. But the subject of the book was Swami Kriyananda's life, and I had to start at the beginning and read through and reconstruct and relive. It's a first-hand account for the most part. So it was my own life experience too. So I really was there. But in the quiet of not being distracted and just staring at these facts, which were in these voluminous files and, just paper, hundreds of pieces of paper, it would just be like I would know things that I didn't know. And it was extremely clear to me that Swami was just explaining it to me. And I didn't hear his voice talking to me, although sometimes I did. But I just knew things. There was this confidence about what was going on that was not based on maybe yes, maybe no, could be, maybe not. You just move into another dimension. The way I put it, I struggled with this book for a long time until I went into seclusion. And then when I went into seclusion, and the first seclusion was really deep, I was way in this isolated place, it started telling me what it was supposed to be. And Swamiji has always talked about creativity as simply tuning into what is and then being the instrument to manifest it. That you're not creating, you're just attuning and then expressing. So the book started telling me what it was supposed to be, and Swami basically started explaining to me what was important and what needed to be said. And, when you get into that kind of a creative flow, it's not mental, you're not thinking. You're not even aware that it's happening. You're just simply, it's unfolding. It's telling you what it's supposed to be, and you just go with that flow. It's tremendously fun. And the reason it's so much fun is because you're not present. And oneself is the real drag in all circumstances. But when you can connect it all in some kind of a superconscious flow and be an instrument for something that's trying to happen, by definition, you're out of the picture. But then Swami just, creative writing is my creative field. Well, I'm good at, I can do a few other things, but not like I can write. But it's just like, there's thousands of words, like 200,000 words in this book, whatever the number is. But if one sentence was wrong, it would just nag at me. And I really felt that Swami was just telling me. I used the word irresponsible to describe something, and he had never used that word to describe that. But it was a good word. But when I would be walking around outside, when I'd wake up in the morning, I could just hear Swami say to me, Asha, that's not the right word. And I would argue. I like the word, sir, it works very well. He said, yeah, but I would never have said that. Well, you could have. You didn't, but you could have. No, actually, it's really not the right word. And we'd go days. And then there was this other, the book demanded this great loyalty to time, but I had this great phrase that I really wanted to use. It was his own words. And he'd said it, and I'm on the spectrum, here's the 1974, and he said it back over here about 1986. But it fit real well in 74, so I put it in there. Days and days and days, and I would think about it, and I would try, and then I'd go back and I'd look at it and say, but it works really well there. And so I'd push it aside, and then it would just harass me. Until it got to be a joke. All right, I'll take it out, and then I would take it out, and then total peace would reign. And so, yeah, I just felt like he was helping me. When he asked me to write this book, he said, I will help you. And it came out completely different than I expected it to. I had an idea in my mind, from years ago, of how it was going to come out. Bears no resemblance to my ideas. It didn't work until I started listening. And he was the instrument because he knows what's needed to move Ananda forward. It's not personal. This book is not really, it's not personal. I present him, but I don't present him as a personality. I present him as an instrument. Both, but you understand. It's not personality worship. It's serving. So when I was wrong, it would bother me. And then gradually I could figure it out. I know that many of you were here when Narayani was here, and she told the story about the exclamation point. Yeah, she had one word in the book that she wrote about her years with Swamiji. The word was, in Swami's response, the word was good. Swami said good. That was his actual answer. She wakes up, And she feels him telling her there's something wrong with that. So she goes and looks at it. She examines every word. It's exactly what happened. The next day, there's something wrong with it. The third time, she's just like, but, she's telling, but Swami, this is what happened. Then she realized she'd put an exclamation point. And she realized that that wasn't how he said it. He said it completely differently, that it wasn't good, like that. It was very serious and very solemn. And the exclamation point changed the meaning. So she took it off. And then he was fine. It went away. Well, here's another thing, and this is, all of that I'm saying is, a lot of this is in the book. Swami said a lot of people get inspiration, but only a few people have the energy to sustain the inspiration. So there's two levels of it. To be inspired is not as hard as it is to follow through on the inspiration and not quit. And this book was just so big that I many times, I really just had to exhale and accept that this could take me the rest of my life and I would be lucky to finish. And that I just had to completely remove from my thought any thought of an end point, because that was taking my energy away. But Swami said, let's see, there was a folk singer named Donovan, who there was a movie called Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, and he did the soundtrack for it, and it was about St. Francis. And Donovan wrote Francis's canticle to the creatures, Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon. And he wrote a song, which is a folksy kind of song. Swami Kriyananda put that same poem to music. The poem he used was written in the original Old Italian, Canticle of the Creatures. It's a beautiful, the two songs couldn't be more different. The opening melody for both songs is identical. That both of them received the inspiration, because Swami felt he heard Francis sing it. He wrote what he heard Francis sing. But Donovan heard Francis sing it too. But as Swami says, and I didn't write out the whole melody, Donovan couldn't hold it. So the first melody line is inspired, and then it becomes very predictable after that. But Swami had the energy to sustain it all the way through to the end. So that's also a really big part of it. Inspiration is just the beginning. It's just an enormous amount of committed energy to keep up with it. And that was my part. I've written 3 other books, and all of them are little short segments. They're very episodic, because I would say I can concentrate very hard for a short period of time. And so I wrote these books where I could just do these little tiny bits, but this was something completely else. Yes.
For you, or maybe for all of us, how important is gratitude in holding that energy, in that carrying the inspiration forward?
Well, I would say in your marriage, how important is gratitude? With your children, how important is gratitude? With your friends, how important is gratitude? If somebody is grateful, you just want to give more. If somebody is not, it stops. So this is just a relationship. All of these relationships are practice for that one. The rules are really pretty much exactly the same. You have to listen, you have to try hard, you have to be grateful, and you have to show up the next morning, no matter how mad you were when you went to sleep that night. You just have to keep coming back. And if you don't quit, you see, you're on the right side of reality now. And so it will work out. That's the principle of Ananda. Where there is dharma, there is victory. If you're on the right side, no matter how crummy you are, that's so important. You can be so crummy, you can be unspeakably crummy, because we are, or have been. But as soon as you turn and face the right direction, it's just energy, you can just shift it. You usually can't shift it fast, not because it's not theoretically possible, but because most of us can't generate in an instant the same amount of energy that we've spent a lifetime putting in. In theory, if we could, we could. But usually we have to do it a penny at a time. But once you start putting it in the right direction, and if you think of it as a balance scale, if it's been tipped that way, and you can just tip it this way, this looks like almost nothing, but it's everything. Because then when you put the marble down, it rolls where you want it to go instead of rolling away from it.
You touched on this before, but I mention it because it's been important for me. Whether it's in business or in meditation or almost anything, what I find is if I'm grateful for what I receive or the situation that I'm in, and if I try to make the most of it, then more tends to be given and it tends to lead to the next best opportunity. So for me, those are two big ingredients, being grateful and making the most of wherever I find myself.
That's absolutely the truth of it. Think of it in very human terms. If you give your child a present and you give your little girl a Barbie doll and you bought her the pink one and she wants the purple one, and she smashes up the pink one and demands that you buy her a purple one, what are the chances? If you have a brain, you're not going to do it for her. But if she says, oh, well, I thought I wanted the purple one, but the pink is nice, and I can put a purple ribbon on it, or I can trade with my girlfriend, she has some purples. I mean, you just start, and then because also, they have all these poetic ways of saying this, and so I'll say it in a devotee's way, which makes sense to some people and not to others. It's like we have to prove to God that we're serious this time. Everybody wants to be a renunciate when your husband walks out. Now I'll be a monk. My wife left me for another man, so now I'll be a monk. I really want to be a monk. No, you don't really want to be a monk. You want your wife back, but she's not here anymore. That's not the same. So it's like things are not going my way. I'm going to devote myself to God. Oh, look, things are going my way again. It's fair weather friends. If you're just only there when it suits you, that's not very magnetic. I mean, think of it in human terms. If you help someone when they're down and out, and then when they get back on their feet, they never look at you again, then you don't have a lot of faith. And the next time they come back and say, oh yeah, I'm your friend, maybe. And that's how the divine is with us. We've spent a lot of lifetimes just trying to get for ourselves. So when we start saying that we're really here to give, we have to prove it a little bit. So yeah, it's exactly right. Laws of prosperity. Everything in the human world is the same in the divine world. That's why we have a human world. But we just to elevate it. Well, I feel like I've offered what little tiny bit I can offer on this. I hope it was helpful. Very interesting subject. Okay, God bless you.